Alright, me. It is the beginning of August, and I just finished reading A Guide to Ancient Greek Drama by Storey and Arlene Allan. As noted, this is a very, very heavy nonfiction piece that goes into very specifically the drama, right? And the history of specifically drama in Greek literature, right? The important thing here to note is that this book defines a line between theater and drama. Theater is what we think of when we think of plays, right? It is the acting portion. It is the interpretation of lines and things like that, and how it's performed. Dramas in this book's view of it is very specifically on the plays themselves and their development, and tracking the development of the creation of plays through what is written in the text, right? Which is a very, very interesting way to go about doing this. I will admit that I did not like the majority of this in reading it, mostly because, I mean, part of it is because I'm in the process of adjusting to a new, style of living, and really having to go back into having to be at work for 8 hours and then coming back and reading this was just tiring at times. But it also reminded me a great deal of why I stopped doing or stopped really being interested in going into environmental engineering and animal sciences, because it gets so hung up on, or like why I stopped doing it. It was because I stopped liking biology. It was because it gets so hung up on the minutia of things that some are relevant but some are not, because it has to be so specific because it doesn't know what the application is for. And so it just kind of drags and drags and drags. However, there's one very important thing that gets noted in this a piece that I did feel very much called out by, but it does make a very, very distinct point to say that the way that we look at theater is very much a very Western-minded way of thinking about it. It's because we have a distinct and personal interest in the people and the characters of something rather than the plot of something, right? And it's because in my, as I will claim in my own personal view, right, is that a plot is a structure, yes, and it is important to understand the plot of something, but it is the characters' decisions and motivations that then drive that plot forward, right? Versus what we see, especially in tragedy of the Greeks, and in the early periods and then the early periods of comedy, is that it is all about the plot of it, and then the characters are just kind of existing in the world, right? So yeah. It was very interesting to kind of see and figure out, how we get to this point of where we are in theater, because it is so well documented, but also not documented at all, right? It's going through the combing of different pieces of literature to find out how this thing that is so important to, and we consider so much just a basic part of our lives and the way that we think and the way that we just produce entertainment, it can be specifically developed and tracked, right? Because it goes from this chorus of people that are reciting portions of poetry and epics, to then beginning a focus on the leader of that chorus having some more individual parts, and then that kind of developing into its own character, and then you have one character against the chorus, and then eventually you begin to have two characters against the chorus, and then eventually you get at the very end of Old Tragedy, you have three characters in the chorus, and then you slowly begin to develop different actors and specialities and things. It's all just very, in that portion, right? It's very intriguing on how you get to that point, right? It also talks a lot about how we can see how certain playhouses and certain portions of theaters were slowly developed and kind of homogenized throughout Greece by the inclusion and the repetition of certain key plot points or uses of characters, right? Like the Deus Ex Machina, which is the god from the machine, which is quite literally effectively a winch that you place a character in that is usually representative of a god, and they are just suspended from the sky, right? And it's just a really fascinating piece of the development of what we just kind of consider a basic trope in theater, right? And then we eventually get into the production of comedy, and comedy, I think, right, it has this sort of development period of where you have tragedy going from being this very plot driven to slowly becoming more character driven, and then you have almost the reverse effect in comedy, in which you have it, with old comedy, it is very crude, yes, right, but it is so focused on the topical moments, right, the Aristophanes, and looking at things that are happened in recency in his contemporary period, and making specific call-outs to specific people, making references to specific points in history, and then very, very slowly you get to the middle period, which is, as described, is very focused on like the plays of the gods and plays of myth and legend, and then eventually you get to the comedy of errors, right, which is the new comedy, which is, I think, what we generally kind of think of as when we think of comedy, right? Because it is the plot point is much like Old Tragedy. The plot's already kind of set in motion, and what's going to happen. The beats are already there. It's just a difference in who's doing it, right? Or the misunderstanding to get to where we are, right? The best way I can really think about explaining this would be like new comedy being, sitcoms, right? It's the story beats and how we follow through with them in a lot of ways end up being the same when we watch through a serialized portion of things, but it is just the characters are switched, or specific points are switched, but we still get that same general gist of things, right? Versus old comedy or the original comedy, which what's supposed to describe, like old comedy is just very very situational. It's very like almost stand-up like, and then you have the satyr play, which kind of exists between tragedy and comedy, which is, as kind of defended in this book, the satyr play almost serves as ensuring that this play, or that the plays that were being created for Greece were still kind of connected to Dionysus in some way, because eventually you start straying away from that sort of deal. And so the satyr play is effectively an insurement to make sure that we're still on the same path, right? And that the festivals that we have are still dedicated to Dionysus. But I think the way that I've conceptualized satyr plays are effectively Austin Powers, because it is looking at a piece of myth or legend or fable that is very well established, and then you just say, well, what if we just put the most ridiculous character in it, right? In the same way that we have done Austin Powers and James Bond, right? Of where it's all the same things are happening, but now it's comedic because we have this character that is so ridiculous at doing it, right? It's also very reminiscent of the John le Carré book that I read, right? Of where you have this character that is supposed to be this cool action hero person, but is really just this bumbling idiot that is so obsessed with women, right? And the same kind of goes for the satyr plays, right? You're replacing your heroes of antiquity with then satyrs, right? Which are very, very primalistic, I guess is the best way to put it, right? They're very food and sex driven. So it's very, in that sense, right? In the 12 minutes now that I spent talking about it, right? If that was the style of this book, I think I would have enjoyed it a lot more. But unfortunately, it's written much more like long thesis papers, just not with as many references embedded through them, right? God, the problem becomes, right, is that this book is really written in the same way that I probably would have approached it as well, right? Is looking at, okay, we have the development of theater. We're gonna break it down chronologically first, and then within each chronology, we are going to then highlight key people also in chronology, right? And that's exactly how I would have done this, right? It's just that it just wasn't enjoyable for me to read, right? Which is unfortunate. But yeah, that is a guide to ancient Greek drama. Oh, last thing I should say, this book also has quite an extensive collection at the very end of play synopses. Part of the problem with when you're looking at theater in this way, right, is that, as mentioned before, you're looking at theater in a way in which you are basically trying to put the puzzle together from fragments, right? Because we have very few plays that are in even the majority of its content, right? A lot of them are fragments of things that we've kind of pieced together in some way. And so it becomes, in some ways, a guessing game, right? Or just such intense focus on very specific things, which is part of the reason why I didn't really like it, right? Is because of the way that we've had to rebuild the history of drama and theater. You have to argue such minutia to get there, right? So that's that.